Well, welcome to this lecture. It's a part of the launch of the book, Political Corruption in Africa, which has recently come out, that I edited. We had a little session this morning talking about one of the chapters. We will have another session at 1 o'clock, presenting more of the chapters and having a discussion about the entire book. Now I want to delve into the conceptual and theoretical part of it. Some of my motivation for going for this book. I have been working more than 15 years on corruption, anti-corruption, doing research, doing consultancies for donor agencies and others. And I feel that there has been much confusion about the concept of corruption. There has been a mix of apples and pears. People have been talking past each other. And a lot of the research have missed the point. A lot of the anti-corruption efforts have missed the points, because there has not been a proper definition of what political corruption is. There has been a confusion of political corruption with administrative bureaucratic corruption, which I think are two very different phenomena. So that's part of the background. I'm not happy with some of the current research, and I'm not happy with some of the current approaches. So I want to get things right. That's the basic idea for this session. Which means I would like to define political corruption as something different from bureaucratic or administrative corruption, and also explain why I think this is important. And secondly, there are two mechanisms within political corruption that we need to distinguish between and keep apart. It's an analytical approach. Political corruption is partly about extraction, meaning getting the money in for the ruling elite. And it's partly about spending this money and other monies to preserve their hold on power. These are two very different mechanisms. And it's very dangerous when you have a situation where the ruling elite is extracting from the economy and reinvesting this money in their hold on power. Then they are really hard to rationalize or democratize, to get rid of. I will also go into a few recent trends in political corruption. As we have said earlier today, and said again and again, sometimes this fight against corruption is like squeezing a balloon. So tighten it in here and it will find some other ways, find some other forms, blow up somewhere else. Some global trends, some links between political corruption and authoritarianism, and what anti-corruption means then when we are talking about political corruption. I believe bureaucratic corruption can relatively easily be dealt with if the government so wishes. Even Napoleon did it. A number of countries have done it. It's possible to rule out bureaucratic corruption if there is a political will to do so. The mechanisms we know. It's about meritocracy, it's about decent pay, it's about social status of the bureaucrats, etc., etc. So this can be done. But political corruption, when a ruling elite are corrupt, is corrupt, that's a different ballgame. Much more difficult to get hold of. Much more difficult to counter. to work against. So that is what I'm going to say a few things about in the end. Okay, to define corruption. And now we are talking about corruption in general, both political and bureaucratic. The World Bank thumb rule says it is abuse or capture of public power for private benefit. I think that's a good one. Let's stick to that. Transparency International says it is misuse of entrusted power for private gain, which is almost the same, but Transparency International is not insisting on public power, but any sort of power, any sort of entrusted power, which means Transparency International wants us also to include corruption in between private companies, for instance. Corruption between private companies and customers. I will insist on keeping the World Bank definition and bring the state back in, because that's when we have a problem. When the government, when the state is corrupt. If there is corruption between a private company and their customers, this is something that will be sorted out pretty swiftly if detected. You will be fired. Political corruption, then, is when these political decision makers abuse their power for private benefit. And private benefit is not only to fill up their pockets, but it's also, as I said, to reuse, reinvest some of this money in their hold on power. I will come back to how they do it. So I will insist on the two actors in a corrupt relationship, the state on the one hand, anybody elected, nominated, self-nominated to take care of the interest of the entire population, that is the government on the one side, and any non-government actor. It takes two to tango. So we have basically the private businesses that are corrupting the state agents. We can have NGOs, we can have private citizens, we can have foreign companies, but any non-state actor. So these are the two main actors in a corrupt relationship. Okay? Now, this is one of my basic points. The distinction between political corruption and bureaucratic administrative corruption. The distinction is not very clear-cut because there are severe overlaps or important overlaps between politics and bureaucracy and state administration. They can influence each other in many ways, and political scientists have shelf meters of literature on the distinction between politics and administration. But still, for analytical purposes, I think it's very useful. The politicians are those who are elected or nominated, those who have the power to make the rules of the game. They make the laws, and they interpret the laws. They can put themselves above the law. So to make the rules of the game, those with that power, I will say, are on the political side. Bureaucratic administrative corruption, or administration at all, then we are talking about the people who are hired to put in place government policies, right? Those who are implementing public policies, where public administration meets the people. So the distinction should be quite clear. Now let's think theoretically. Can you have countries where you have political corruption, but no administrative corruption? I have put up a little flag, France. could serve as an example, possibly. I had a colleague, a French professor of political science, who was also working on corruption. He said that in France, if you, for instance, go to visit as a tourist and you hire a car and you speed and you are caught by the police, don't try to bribe your way out of that. The police force in France is not corrupt. Then they will charge you for trying to bribe a public official, and that will bring you into even more problems than you had. He said the entire civil service in France is very clean. People are proud of serving the state. People do not take bribes to give you services. This has to do with social esteem, it has to do with relatively good pay, it has to do with an esprit de corps, spirit of the entire civil service. But we know at the top of French politics there have been a number of huge scandals involving the ruling party, former ruling party, involving senior officials all the way up probably to the presidency. Madame Eva Joly has told us a lot about these stories where she was investigating high-level political corruption in France. The question is then for how long will a civil service be clean if their superiors, the politicians, are not? You can perhaps think of cases where you have a clean government on the top of a very corrupt bureaucracy. And these are the cases where a new government has been elected in. Some governments come in on an anti-corruption platform, for instance, with a deep-rooted interest in cleaning up the system and not being involved themselves in the same kind of corrupt practices that their predecessors had. So this is theoretically possible, and it has happened in a few countries. Unfortunately, these clean governments tend to go corrupt again after a while. Some say they have 100 days to clean up the system, and that's almost impossible. And all the pressures from below and from the outside to be corrupt is still there, and it cannot be withstood. So unfortunately, there are not many cases of enduring clean governments at the top of a bureaucratic, heavily corrupt bureaucratic system, unfortunately. Okay. Then let's look into the methods or the mechanisms of political corruption. What do corrupt politicians do? On the one hand, as I said, they are extracting from the economy, getting the money in. And they are spending some of this money and other monies to preserve their hold on power. Getting the money in is what we usually understand as bribery, for instance, taking commissions, kickbacks on government contracts, taking percentages, grease money. This baby has a lot of names. Bribery is one mechanism. Embezzlement is another. They can steal from the state coffers, more or less directly. Some of these privatizations we have seen in a number of countries is what I would call embezzlement, when public companies are being sold to regime insiders for peanuts. That's a transfer of public assets to private pockets. Fraud, Sometimes government officials might be directly involved in fraud, economic crime. Sometimes they will take some payment to not look at it, to let it pass, to let it happen. There's an element of cheating here. And also tax systems can be created and manipulated or established in a way that gives preferences to those in power and their supporters and their backers. So there is a lot of frauds. Sometimes you can have direct extortion, an element of violence to it. Extortion at gunpoint. From the real top, there is not so much of it, but government officials might extort from private businesses, saying that you will have a license, you will have an import license, for instance, if you pay up. Or they can threaten you to close down your whole business. They can send the tax authorities after you, etc. There's a lot of ways they can put pressure on private companies to pay up. These are basically the four mechanisms of how ruling elites are getting their money in. What is less known and what is less studied in academic studies on political corruption or corruption at all is how ruling elites are reinvesting this money to stay in power. One of the mechanisms is to buy friends. Favoritism. They can favor groups that needs to be favored to support them politically, ethnically, regionally, religious groups. They can. There is a lot of clientelism, patronage out there. They give favors to certain individuals, to certain groups, to please them, to get them on board, to have them as supporters. Co-optation is when you buy political rivals or opposition politicians who are willing to change sides against some nominations, some preferences, some money. Nepotism is when they put their family members into ruling elite positions. We also have the mechanism of buying support from voters at elections. Vote buying, called handouts in a number of countries. And this is described in detail in some of the chapters of the book, how politicians pay voters to vote for them, that it is expected, that it is normal, that it is one of the ways, one of the mechanisms you have to use to be elected. We also have examples of parliamentary majorities being bought by money. It costs Museveni in Uganda something like $5,000 per vote in parliament to take away the legal provision that the president could not stand for more than 2 times. So one can buy support from parliament and other state institutions. They can buy themselves impunity, lift themselves above the law by buying up courts and judges. And these oversight and control institutions can be bought off. For instance, a number of anti-corruption commissions have gone some steps closer to the ruling elite, but as soon as they get very close to the pecuniary interests of some big shots, the president will nominate somebody else as leader of the anti-corruption commission to ensure that so far, but no further you are allowed to go. Political nominations are being used frequently to silence people, give them a position, and let them know that they have to behave and do no criticism and no opposition, or they will be fired again. And if this is not enough to secure your hold on power, you can always use some of the money to buy the military hardware and the security apparatus you need to keep people in place and out of rivalry of power. In Angola, there are now more than 300 private security companies. Most of them are being hired by big business, but also big politicians to protect them. So military or police suppression of opposition is a last resort. And as I said, when both of these mechanisms take place at the same time, you have a regime that have the incentives to stay in power, and you have a regime that have the means to stay in power. And that will be very hard to get rid of. We must make a short little digression here, a short step aside, and talk about the two perspectives. I'm always told that, yes, but you cannot always blame the government. The government is not always those who are to be blamed for high levels of political corruption. You also have the supply side. It takes two to tango. So on the one hand, you have the corrupted public side, the extractive, sometimes called neo-patrimonial or even kleptocratic state, as a theoretically ideal form, rule of thieves, ruled by thieves. And I put up some of the biggest, most corrupt leaders, according to Transparency International, currently. In Eritrea, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Equatorial Guinea. These are really kleptocrats, right? Real kleptocrats. They run the show for their own purpose. But sometimes governments might be bought up by private interests. This is what the World Bank calls captured states. And I put up the bananas because we had some banana republics in Latin America previously, at least. States that had been bought up by the major businesses in the country to the extent that the private companies got the tax regime they wanted, the legal regime they wanted, any regulation on environment and social security and workers' conditions being dictated by the company against payments to the government. So we have to have this perspective in place also. We are not only talking about the kleptocrats, but there are other culprits. That was too quick. How can political corruption be controlled? As I said, in a system with political corruption, this corruption gives the ruling elite the incentives to hold on to power, or to gain power, to stay in power, and it gives them the means to stay in power. Right? We have this expression in Norwegian that nobody wants to saw off the branch they are sitting on. So we cannot expect much from that corner, from the top. In order to control political corruption, then, it can be done either authoritarian way or in a democratic way. democratic institution building and ring fencing. It's a long process with a number of setbacks and no sure outcome. But in those countries of the world where we have no problem of political corruption, we have had a long process of democratization. That's what brought control of political corruption in place. I don't think there are any other examples. There are a few authoritarian governments that are relatively clean. But then authoritarian control is much more efficient when it comes to controlling bureaucratic or administrative corruption than in terms of controlling their own. This is a question of regime type. But I believe there is no other way, no other efficient, sustainable way to control political corruption or reduce political corruption than in the long, strenuous process of democratization. Some global trends. One is that it is now much more difficult to be an autocrat and put your money in Swiss banks and invest in the United States or anywhere else. There is a legal ban on corruption. There is more and more legal bans on money transfers, on investments from dubious sources, etc. So we have international conventions and more enforcement. And business organizations are taking up the issue of corruption because it's important, more and more important for businesses to be clean. We have a large number of NGOs out there. We have cooperation at various levels. So it's not so easy any longer to be an autocrat and to stash your money where you want it, as it was a few years back. But still, they do it. They find new ways. Question again about squeezing the balloon. And you have some national restrictions. You have some legal developments. For instance, much of these international conventions have been incorporated into national law in more and more countries. So at least you have the legal framework in place, and that helps. That is something that civil society or activists and others can call upon. At least it is there. And also, the international conventions are saying that even when national legislation lack the proper paragraphs, you can refer to the international convention that the government has signed. And international conventions also make it possible to bring people to court in countries outside, where the company, for instance, is based, or where the company shares are listed. So, for instance, a Norwegian company bribing people in Congo can be brought to court in the United States simply because the Norwegian company is listed on the US stock market. So there mechanisms are being more and more sophisticated to curb international corruption. We also have institutional developments. A large number of countries have introduced these anti-corruption commissions. Even if they don't work properly, they are there at least, doing some good work, for instance, in awareness raising and mobilizing people. And as I said, business developments, business companies, private companies do have to protect their reputation. They can be blacklisted internationally and nationally. And we have a much more open media, social media also, so it's harder to conceal the more and more scandals are coming up. And civil society activists are learning from what is going on in neighboring countries. So the pressure is also coming from the inside. And that's important. Now, when we are talking about squeezing the balloon, there are some mechanisms that we have seen popping up as alternatives to the good old traditional bribes. In Angola, I first encountered the term dead meat companies. I was a representative of one of the big American oil companies who said that now foreign oil companies operating in Angola have been encouraged to go into partnership with local Angolan oil companies to help develop them. It's a part of a, not nationalization, but national strategy of developing their own competencies. So far, so good. Norway also did that to establish Statoil, for instance. So it's fair enough politically. But in the Angolan case, these companies had nothing in terms of money, nothing in terms of personnel, nothing in terms of technology. They had nothing but a postbox address. And the foreign companies did not dare not take them aboard still, because they could be kicked out, and some have been from Angola. And these companies were owned by directors and former directors of the Ministry of Petroleum, of other ministers, high-level people, all of them, dignitaries in the ruling party and the government, who put up these dead meat companies, didn't provide anything up front, but they were on the spot when the revenues, profits were being distributed. In Norway, it is illegal to have a shell company or an anonymous company. But in Angola, it's perfectly legal. So this case of Statoil operating in Angola was lifted up to the higher level in Norway, questioning how Statoil could enter into cooperation with two Angolan anonymous companies. And they said, this is legal where we operate, so. And they also said, and we simply do not know who owns them. But you could ask anybody in Angola and they would say the names of the owners, and they were high-level officials. So that's one way of extraction that seems to be on the rise. It's all about cronyism, crony capitalism, where government officials, top-level politicians, create their own businesses. And they give these businesses government preferences, guarantees, loans, etc. And push them into, give them preferences when it comes to cooperation with foreign companies. But also corporate social responsibility is being abused. A number of foreign investors, foreign companies do want to enhance their standing and reputation by doing some investments in schools and hospitals, for instance, locally. And then the politicians of the country is on the spot and making sure that these investments are done where it is politically favorable for them. And this we have also seen from Angola, and I think there are a number of other cases, Nigeria. Public-private partnerships is something that is coming up. everybody is talking about. Now it is the private sector that is supposed to save the world, and private businesses, and these joint ventures between public ministries and public companies and private investors is being more and more popular, but again, it's being politically manipulated and abused by those who have the insight, the insiders. Local content policies are also being abused to put in the companies of politicians into cooperation with foreigners. Another issue that we see coming up more and more is compte or budget, or money kept out of the state budget. As the state budgeting process is becoming more and more open, according to international standards, more and more transparent, etc., some of the money is simply kept out of that system. And one of the really dangerous methods of keeping public money out of control and out of sight for public scrutiny is to let the military own businesses. Turkey is very good at this. A number of Middle East countries are doing it. In Palestine, they are probably doing it. This way, this collusion between politicians and private companies can be kept out of the public eye, because they say, oh, it's a security issue, it's a military issue, secrecy. But in Turkey, for instance, the military are running hospitals, golf clubs, insurance companies, a lot of businesses that would be, if it wasn't for the fact that they were owned by the military, would have been on the open market and subjected to much more scrutiny and competition. So it's protected, these can be protected from competition also. That's one of the squeezing of the balloon's new forms that corruption seems to take. So this, when it comes to new forms of power preservation, power preserving methods, of course this cronyism and crony capitalism, this close connections between senior politicians and businesses, and the fact that they are owning businesses is really a part of the problem, and really a way that they can secure their power. But also the use of middlemen is coming up as a part of this crony capitalism setup. You have the big four, these consultancy companies that are helping, avoiding taxes, helping doing the investments, and I suspect helping creating the shady deals as part of it. More importantly, perhaps, is some of the new tendencies of abusing and abusing anti-corruption commissions, tax authorities, and other state institutions to keep rivals and opposition out. There was a case from Uganda. Alice, what was her name? She wanted to stand for president against Museveni. Alice, I don't remember her last name. But as soon as she presented her candidacy to stand for presidential elections, the president sent the tax authorities after her. They said that, oh, there is something wrong in the books. You have not paid your taxes properly. And this is a serious enough allegation, according to Ugandan law, to bar you from standing for election. So simply by being accused, she could not stand for election. So she was eradicated from the electoral lists. That's one way of getting rid of rivals. And these anti-corruption commissions, unfortunately, the big shots that they have taken, the big fish that they have fried, the people that have been sentenced, have all been opposition politicians or rivals to those in power. None of these anti-corruption commissions have been allowed to take any of the ruling elite insiders anywhere. And many of them are being supported by donor money. So indirectly, aid money is supporting the survival of authoritarian regimes around the world, unfortunately. Another global trend is that control of corruption is not good. These statistics from the World Bank and others on control of corruption is simply showing that control of corruption is going down globally. There is actually less and less control of corruption if you look at the overall statistics, except for in a few countries. This is a list: Georgia, Rwanda, Estonia, Qatar, Uruguay, Botswana, South Korea, Taiwan, Costa Rica, and Chile have all made significant improvements in controlling corruption in their countries between 1996 and 2015. These are hard statistics, and these are the only countries that have significantly reduced corruption in their countries in this period. But all of them are outliers, I would say. Take, for instance, Qatar. The level of corruption in Qatar now is so low that it's on par with most Western European countries. France, Italy, no, France is a good example. But, Qatar is ruled by the emir. He owns the country. He owns the country to such an extent that the Qataris are not citizens, they are subjects. He controls all the wealth of the country. He hands out annually to his citizens a good lump of money every year. They are not paying taxes, but they get money from him. But he has disciplined the civil service, the administration, the bureaucracy, to such an extent that Qatar is quite clean at that level. So clean at that level that in international statistics, Qatar is now a relatively clean country, like France. But this is again a complete misuse or a complete lack of distinction between political and administrative corruption. When you mix the two, and one is going down severely, significantly, it looks good. But I don't think corruption problem in Qatar looks that good. Estonia did want to join the European Union and had to clean up and did implement a number of measures and did get the laws right in order to be qualified to enter the European Union. And they did get all the assistance needed to do that. And they did have the political will at the top in order to join the European Union. So they have done it. Botswana was always a relatively democratic country, so was Costa Rica and Chile. But Rwanda again, Uruguay, Rwanda especially, is again one of these cases of authoritarian control of corruption. With such a good authoritarian control of bureaucratic corruption that the country is now figuring in the statistics as one of the countries that have eradicated or at least controlled corruption. But bureaucratic corruption, not necessarily political. And when I insist that control of political corruption takes the long route of deepened democratization to be achieved, the level of democratization in the world is also going down, unfortunately. From 2006 to 2018, 113 countries declined over 12 consecutive years. This is Freedom House ratings, global freedom. Only 62 experience a net improvement. One of the democratic controllers is Botswana. Botswana have strengthened the parliamentary control of the presidency and of the government significantly, and moved strongly in the direction of deepened democratization. So this is one of the examples of a democratic development that is also seen in better control of corruption. I think that is important. We have some time for comments and discussion. Yes. Take this one so we can hear you.
Yeah, so thanks for this really interesting presentation on political corruption. What I was thinking about and what I missed a little bit is the connection to the social order and the society, because there is my understanding, and I think quite of the very influential literature, for instance, Joel Migdal's Strong Societies, Weak States, or Chabal and Dallos, who like point out like that it is, you cannot look at this separately at political corruption or even bureaucratic corruption without looking at the social order and structure of the society in which the political system is embedded into, right? Especially in developing countries where the nation state and the bureaucratic structure is in many times actually a kind of project that has been implemented by Western powers, actually, where the social structure or people would expect that someone in a political position would distribute. Redistributive politics are a major thing that you cannot look as a separate means, actually. So I would be interested in how you would look into this relationship between society and political corruption, because I didn't see that having a very prominent space at the moment. And the second thing is actually that I think like we tend to look at corruption always looking southwards to Africa or Latin America. But if you look very closely, actually, corruption happens to a perhaps even higher degree with different manifestations in the West, right? So I don't know, I look to Germany or Austria where I lived or come from, and if you look at large infrastructure projects, you often have different ways in which corruption might be implemented, that you have like lower bids for large infrastructure projects, but then the costs triple, quadruple, or even more. So you have former politicians who then go into the advisory council of former of Gazprom, for instance. If you look at Gerhard Schröder, who was a chancellor in Germany and now sits in the advisory council of a Russian energy company, you have all these types, and I think you have that very clearly in the US. You have that also, I think, to a degree, perhaps even in Norway. I'm not sure, actually. A couple of months ago, I think there was something in the media about some development money where there was a bit of embezzlement. So I think it would be fair to say that this also happens with maybe a bit more sophistication, also in more established democracies, where it might not be used to buy off votes like as in some other countries, but I think it deserves some attention actually, because otherwise it gets this not so favorable bias towards looking at from the West towards the rest. These were my 2 comments, and I also would appreciate your comment about that.
Maybe I can answer briefly before we go on. The political corruption scandals we have had in the West, and Norway included, I would say is almost exclusively on the extraction side. We don't really see money being reinvested in the hold on power. That might be an oversimplification, but I think it shows how important this distinction is.
Yeah, I agree, but it still exists, right? So
It exists. But it's not as dangerous then when the money is not being reinvested in the hold on power. And when it comes to your question about state-society relations, I said a lot about clientelism and patronage as a way of securing the hold on power. And the so-called weak states and strong societies in Africa. This literature is now 15 years old, and the rulers are still there. They are still the same presidents at the top, more or less, basically, as it was 15 years ago. So I don't think they are very weak. At least they are able to stay in power.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a very interesting presentation. My name is Bush Buse. You talk about political corruption with more focus on Africa, and a lot of truth also that you are able to bring out. That is because in some societies in Africa, corruption seems to be like a normal thing that even the society supports in one way or the other. And we have seen in your presentation. In one of the communities in Africa, they also define government as a group of wise people who come together to eat resources of other people. So that is how they view government and people who are in power. My question is, you talk about democratization as a way of controlling political corruption. So the question is, how do you control political corruption through democratization in a government that is politically corrupted and militarized? Thank you.
Quick. I'll try to be very quick to answer that. You have to go into each situation and see where the ruling elite is getting their money from, and if there are any possibilities of curbing some of their income strategies. And you have to look at what are their preferred methods of staying in power to buy power, and see if there are any where you can restrict that reinvestment of money in staying in power. For instance, some African countries have now been banning vote buying, handouts. We haven't seen the consequences of that yet, and the pressure is still very great to do it, so probably it will not work. But go through the list on what the government in a given country is actually doing in terms of preserving their power, and be strategic about where can you possibly put in some efforts to curb it.
Who's you in that?
It depends on the country and the circumstances and the way the government is composed. Sometimes it's based on the military, sometimes it's based on a ruling party, sometimes it's based on commercial interests. So it depends. There is no clear answer to how democracy or deepened democratization can address it, but I'm suggesting be strategic and pragmatic about it. See what is going on, what are their preferred methods to extract money and to reinvest it, and see if there are some holes that can be plugged. David?
Yeah, thanks, Inge, for the presentation. I guess when we come up with new concepts and definitions in social science, we do so to try and, because they tell us something about the world, that they help clarify the nature, the social world around us. And I'm wondering to what extent this definition does. It has two aspects. One is spatial, so this distinction between political and bureaucratic. The other is about clarifying certain dynamics around corruption. And I really like this side. I think this is extremely useful, and I think this helps clarify dynamics and how corruption is systemic and it's connected. So I really like this, but I'm wondering if the political bureaucratic distinction, as Carlo said, is actually that helpful, or to which settings does it actually travel? Because it seems to me that you're relying on classical definitions of distinctions between political and bureaucracy, which are coming from Europe and North America, that there is such a thing as an autonomous bureaucracy and a political class who rule over them. But as Carlo hinted at, in many countries, this is very blurry. And politics and bureaucracy may be mutually kind of constitutive, or and at the same time, you see many of the extraction, preservation dynamics in bureaucracy. So if you're a director at the hospital, often they are extracting in order to, and then they will redistribute jobs or other rents in order to preserve their position at the hospital. So, yeah, my question is whether we need the political side of these dynamics, whether that clarifies things in settings where things are a bit messy. And my other, point, a little bit repetitive, but yeah, with democratization, I think we have to be clear about actually what is it of democratization that leads to corruption? Because we know it's not elections.
No, that's not.
And we know it's not just bringing in Western-style democratic institutions. And what wasn't mentioned are the economic paths out of political corruption. So this is the Mushtaq Khan argument that actually, if you look at the longer-term trends, those that transition away from corruption are not those countries which put in democratic institutions or institutions of good governance. It's actually those countries who grew economically first.
Yeah. I'll take that as a comment.
Okay.
Are you going to go with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Inge. And I think it is really good to have a focus on political corruption, and I agree with your overall thesis that there has been not enough of a focus on this in the anti-corruption kind of discourse and practice world. I had a couple of comments about the universal cases. So so you were fairly categorical about the point that there is not an example of an anti-corruption commission which has not gone after
the current ruling elite core
There is an
members.
example I'm aware of, which is the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission has successfully prosecuted a close family member of the incumbent president of Indonesia, which has been talked about as a case of one of the indicators of improvement of rule of law in Indonesia over the past sort of 15 years. Unfortunately, now it's going in a different direction, but I think that is one case that I think, although I agree with you in general, that I think this is a strategy which is commonly used.
Yeah.
And the other one about cases of power preservation in democracies, political corruption in the mode of power preservation in democracies. So my reading of the allegations around Trump's impeachment with the allegations in Ukraine, if those allegations prove to be correct, that would probably be a case of political corruption in the mode of power preservation in an established democracy.
Yeah. Fully agree. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation and actually for the book. As you were presenting, you were putting a lot of analysis on, the political situations and some of my very own lived experiences, having been born and raised in a very corrupt country like Uganda, and then becoming a citizen of South Sudan, which is very corrupt and interestingly doesn't feature in the in the list of the most corrupt countries. I think there's something that you quite said that really captured my attention with regards to, some of the donor funding, especially from the West. And a country like South Sudan had basically depended on this funding. And as much as there were controls in the beginning, most of this money was really diverted, even from the very highest level. And to counter the grand corruption, UK, EU, all of these donor countries, try to strengthen on some of their controls and perhaps also channel the resources through organizations like the UNDP and other, But my question to you is just, I don't know if it's relevant here, but China is playing a very interesting, role in the mix, perhaps in South Sudan, and you look at the role of the donor institutions as a carrot and stick. You expect it to have a level of democratic progression before you are given A, B, C, D resources. And that didn't happen. And here is China, a really new player. I tend to say that without any standards, doesn't care about your human rights track record, doesn't care what you do, they're just giving. And well, what's your analysis of that dynamic, the entrance of China here with very limited standards and basically now becoming the player in Africa? And I see a lot of very bad deals, and from sitting from the outside, I'm like, what's going on? But China is kind of getting very popular. Just really an analysis of this new entrant and the politics of donor money and all of that. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. I think China is closing their eyes to this and to that. And as you said, to human rights and a lot of other things. And this also brings down the attention to this issue of the Western donors. They have to be careful. They have to tone it down. I think that's what is happening, a rush to the bottom. But that's really not my field of research, only an impression. Moses?
Yeah, thanks Inge for presentation and for this project. I think it's an important intervention to enriching the literature and debates around. I look at this more broadly as part of political development in the global South. I wanted to speak briefly on the question of what about the West? That forget your name. Carlo. Yeah, I think this is an important point, and I think he also mentioned the case of Trump, and I would slightly disagree with you that in the West it's not about power preservation. I think it is in many respects. In the U.S., for example, what we would call political corruption is called campaign financing, right? And it's bizarre. It's crazy just how much, if you like, bad money gets into politics to influence election outcomes, and happens with both parties and both sides of the political divide. My answer to his question about what's different with the global South compared to the West would be that I think the problem with like many African countries is that this kind of power-preserving or extractive political corruption is a lot more deleterious to the common good. It does hurt the average person, and it does hurt the country more than what happens in the West. And the difference is because of more resilient and stronger institutional arrangements in Western countries compared to countries in the global South. And so, cases of embezzlement and fraud and extortion do hurt poor countries more than I believe they do hurt rich countries like Germany or the US. But also, of course, in countries like Germany and the US, the power of the economies is such that there is more resilience because of bigger economic opportunities and that kind of stuff. I also wanted to quickly comment on the distinction we make in the book between political and bureaucratic, realms of corruption, which David was pushing back against. I mean, my sense is that this is a heuristic device, and at the end of the day, empirically speaking, it doesn't always translate one-to-one. That these two, realms are completely separate. There could be some overlaps, definitely. But for what it is worth, in many countries in Africa, definitely there are some, fragments of bureaucracies that exist and administrative apparatuses that function, even if in a poor way, they are there. And there is corruption that goes on in those areas of the state, in administration, in bureaucracy, which are distinctively different from the kind of corruption that we are interested in the book. So I think that the distinction for me is important, even when there are potential overlaps and the line is a little bit.
I've got to stop you. We are running out of time. I will just put in 2 quick comments at the end. Please have a look at Budram's chapter on South Africa. He is talking about a government that was almost captured by some businesses, a big business family. But in the end, the institutions fought back, and the ruling party realized that this cannot go on. It will destroy our power in the long run. And when it comes to the distinction between political and administrative, back to my original hunch on that, motivation for starting the work on this book, is that so much of the anti-corruption efforts, especially by the donors, Western donors, have been on the bureaucratic side. They are trying to depoliticize aid, trying to put in technical solutions into the national bureaucracy without seeing how it takes part in a bigger picture of political corruption, which really ruins the system. So it's self-perpetuating and it's fighting against windmills to put in technical solutions in a bureaucracy where you have a political corruption at the top, unfortunately. Yes, thank you. We have run out of time.